Good morning and welcome to Richard Raw's Daily Meditation from the Centre for Action and Contemplation. The date today is Thursday, May the 14th. The theme for the week is Julian of Norwich, and the title of today's contribution is There is No Anger in God. And Richard Raw begins by saying, author and Episcopal priest Mary Earle explores the difficult decisions that beset individuals during Julian's time as well as our own. She writes, in a social and cultural context, the 14th century, that was so saturated with suffering and death, it is no wonder that many believers interpreted these plagues as clear signs of God's anger with humanity. Certainly, we still see vestiges of this way of interpreting events. The underlying theology draws on a medieval doctrine known as substitutionary atonement, which held, as it still is today, that because of our many sins, we owe God a debt we can never repay. Our burden of debt is so vast that we are finite. That is why Jesus, by dying on the cross, offers himself as a sacrifice in order to satisfy the Father's wrath. It is easy to see how this theology in its crudest form evolved into a belief in an angry and vengeful God, visiting humanity and punishing events. Thus, in Julian's day, popular devotional art often depicted horrific scenes of the Last Judgment, scenes in which souls were being cast into hell, tortured endlessly by devils. Laymen and laywomen of the 14th century would have constantly been wrestling with the why of suffering and the wrath of God. When someone receives a terminal diagnosis or a sudden death occurs or a natural disaster devastates a region, the first question that occurs is usually, why me? The context out of which Julian writes, although in some ways so remote from our own, is one full of universal questions and themes. And then Richard Raw comes back and says, one of Julian's most radical insights, with which I fully concur, is that there can be no wrath in God. Mary Earle continues, Julian's radical insistence that we know there is no anger in God directs us all to look at ways in which we project our own bitterness, anger, and vengeance upon God. In a resolutely maternal way, she encourages us to grow up, to cast aside our immature and punitive images of God, and to be honest with ourselves about our own actions that have their roots in spiritual blindness. Julian tells us again and again in a variety of ways that God is our friend, our mother and our father, as close to us as the clothing we wear. She employs homely imagery and language, the vocabulary of domesticity to tell us their experience. At the same time, she demonstrates a degree of sophisticated theological language. Julian is firm and steady on these points. God is one. Everything is in God. God is in everything. God transcends and encloses all that is made. And then Richard Raw concludes by saying, the only point I would add to that list from my own study of Julian is that she really believes that God is love. The only thing that I personally would add is to remind myself that the great American spiritual writer and Trappist monk Thomas Merton believed that Julian of Norwich was the greatest of English theologians.